Imagine discovering that everything we've been taught about human civilization is wrong, that somewhere beneath the waves lies proof of a society so advanced it makes our modern world look primitive. A place where they mastered technologies we're still trying to understand, built cities that defied physics, and achieved levels of knowledge that shouldn't have existed thousands of years ago. What if I told you that this isn't just fantasy? That the clues have been hiding in plain sight, scattered across ancient texts, underwater formations, and archaeological anomalies that mainstream science refuses to acknowledge? Tonight, we're diving into the most controversial mystery in human history, the lost civilization that could rewrite everything we know about our past. This is the story of Atlantis. Not the Hollywood version, not the New Age fantasy, but the real possibility that an advanced super civilization once existed and vanished so completely that we've convinced ourselves it was just a myth. But here's what they don't want you to realize. The evidence isn't missing, it's been systematically ignored. Welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, and if you're new here, we explore the mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about history. Make sure to subscribe, because what we're about to uncover will change how you see the ancient world forever. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered why the story of Atlantis feels so familiar? Why cultures around the world, separated by thousands of miles and centuries, all tell remarkably similar stories about a great civilization that was swallowed by water? Why does this particular myth refuse to die, even after 2,000 years? The answer might be simpler than you think. What if it's not a myth at all? The story begins in ancient Athens, around 360 BCE, when the philosopher Plato recorded something extraordinary. In his dialogues called Timaeus and Critias, he described a conversation where an Egyptian priest revealed the existence of a lost island civilization. This wasn't presented as fiction or allegory. It was described as historical fact, complete with specific dates, measurements, and geographical details. According to this account, 9,000 years before Plato's time, there existed an island larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. This island, called Atlantis, lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now know as the Strait of Gibraltar. But this wasn't just any island. It was the center of an empire that controlled vast territories across Europe and Africa. The Atlanteans, as Plato described them, were descendants of the sea god Poseidon. Their capital city was a marvel of engineering that seems impossible even by today's standards. Picture concentric rings of water and land, alternating like ripples in a pond. 3 rings of water separated by 2 rings of land, all connected by tunnels and bridges. The outermost ring served as a harbour for ships from around the known world. The inner rings housed palaces, temples, and gardens of unimaginable beauty. But it was the materials they used that truly set them apart. The walls of their city were constructed from red, white, and black stone, but that was just the foundation. These walls were then plated with metals. The outer walls gleamed with brass, the middle walls shone with tin, and the innermost walls blazed with a mysterious substance called orichalcum, described as more precious than gold. At the center of this incredible city stood a temple to Poseidon that defied belief. Inside was a massive golden statue of the sea god himself, driving a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses. The ceiling was covered in ivory, and the entire structure was decorated with gold, silver, and orichalcum. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Plato didn't just describe pretty buildings. He provided specific measurements. The central plain of Atlantis was 3,000 stadia by 2,000 stadia. That's roughly 555 kilometers by 370 kilometers, larger than many modern countries. This plain was surrounded by mountains and connected to the sea by a canal 50 stadia long, about 9 kilometers. These aren't the vague descriptions you'd expect from a fictional story. These are the precise details of someone describing a real place. The Atlanteans themselves were portrayed as master engineers and builders. They had developed sophisticated systems for managing water, bringing fresh mountain springs and hot springs from beneath the earth directly into their city. They had created an agricultural system so efficient it could feed massive populations. Their navy dominated the seas, and their armies were organized with a precision that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. For generations, these people lived in harmony under a system of laws inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum in Poseidon's temple. 10 kings, all descendants of Poseidon, ruled different regions of the island. Every 5 or 6 years, they would gather in the temple to renew their oaths and settle disputes. But power corrupts, and according to Plato, the Atlanteans gradually lost their way. Their divine nature became diluted through intermarriage with mortals. Greed replaced wisdom. Ambition overcame virtue. They began to look beyond their own borders with hungry eyes, seeking to conquer and dominate rather than create and preserve. This hubris led them to challenge Athens itself, the city Plato held up as the ideal of virtue and justice. In his account, Athens stood alone against the Atlantean Empire and, against all odds, emerged victorious. But the gods were not finished with Atlantis. Their moral decay had not gone unnoticed by the divine powers that had once blessed them. In a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, the entire island civilization was swallowed by the sea, leaving nothing but a muddy shoal where a mighty empire once stood. And here's where the story takes a turn that should make every historian uncomfortable. Plato claimed this wasn't his invention. He said the story came from Solon, one of Athens' greatest lawmakers, who had learned it from Egyptian priests during his travels. These priests, keepers of records going back thousands of years, had preserved the memory of this lost civilization in their temple archives. Think about that for a moment. We're not talking about a story passed down through oral tradition, changing with each telling. We're talking about written records maintained by one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world, describing events that supposedly occurred 9,000 years before Plato's time. Now, most scholars today dismiss Atlantis as Plato's philosophical allegory. They argue he created this story to illustrate his ideas about the ideal state and the dangers of moral corruption. And on the surface, that makes sense. Plato was known for using stories and metaphors to convey complex philosophical concepts. But there's a problem with this interpretation. If Atlantis was just a teaching tool, why did Plato go to such extraordinary lengths to make it seem real? Why provide specific dates, measurements, and geographical locations? Why claim it came from Egyptian records? Why risk his reputation as a serious philosopher by presenting obvious fiction as historical fact? And here's something even more troubling. If you actually read Plato's account carefully, you'll notice something strange. The level of detail about Atlantean society, their customs, their government, their architecture, it's remarkably consistent and sophisticated. This doesn't read like someone making things up as they go along. It reads like someone describing a real place they've studied extensively. Consider the concentric ring design of the capital city. This isn't just aesthetically pleasing, it's actually a brilliant defensive strategy. The water rings serve as natural moats, while the narrow passages between them create choke points that would be nearly impossible for an enemy navy to penetrate. Someone with serious knowledge of military engineering designed this layout. Or look at their water management system. The Atlanteans supposedly channeled both fresh water from mountain springs and hot water from geothermal sources throughout their city. This requires advanced understanding of hydraulics and geology. It's not the kind of detail you'd expect from a philosopher creating a fictional society. Then there's the political structure. The system of 10 kings ruling under a common law, meeting regularly to renew their oaths and settle disputes, this is sophisticated political theory. It shows understanding of federal systems, checks and balances, and the importance of regular communication between different regions of an empire. But perhaps most intriguing is the technology. That mysterious metal, orichalcum, has puzzled researchers for centuries. Plato describes it as mined from the earth in many parts of the island, second in value only to gold. Some scholars suggest it might have been a copper alloy, perhaps brass or bronze. But others point out that the way Plato describes it, gleaming with fire-like radiance, suggests something far more exotic. What if orichalcum wasn't just an ordinary metal? What if it represented a level of metallurgical sophistication that we're only beginning to understand? Recent discoveries in materials science have shown that ancient civilizations sometimes achieved results that seem impossible with the tools we thought they had available. The more you examine Plato's account, the more it starts to feel less like fiction and more like a detailed report of a real civilization. A civilization that achieved things we're still trying to figure out how to do. And that brings us to the most important question of all. If Atlantis was real, where is it now? The obvious answer is that it sank beneath the ocean, just as Plato described. But here's where things get complicated. If a landmass the size Plato described really did sink into the Atlantic Ocean 11 to 500 years ago, we should be able to find some trace of it. Modern oceanography has mapped the Atlantic floor in extraordinary detail. We know where every mountain range, every trench, every significant geological feature is located. And we've found nothing that matches Atlantis. But what if we're looking in the wrong place? What if Plato's geographical references weren't as precise as we think? What if the Pillars of Hercules didn't refer to Gibraltar, but to some other narrow strait? What if the Atlantic Ocean mentioned in the story wasn't the body of water we call the Atlantic today? This is where the mystery deepens, because there are places on Earth where something matching Atlantis's description might have existed. Places where advanced civilizations could have thrived before being destroyed by natural catastrophes. Places where the evidence has been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right knowledge to recognize what they're seeing. But before we explore those possibilities, we need to address something that makes mainstream historians deeply uncomfortable: the timeline. According to Plato, Atlantis existed 9,000 years before his time. That places it around 9,600 BCE, well before the rise of any known advanced civilization. This was supposedly during the end of the last ice age, when most of humanity was still living in small hunter-gatherer groups. The idea that a sophisticated civilization could have existed at that time challenges everything we think we know about human development. We're taught that civilization began with agriculture around 10,000 years ago, leading gradually to the first cities, the first writing systems, the first complex societies. An advanced maritime empire existing 11,500 years ago doesn't fit this model. But what if our model is wrong? What if human civilization is far older than we've been taught? What if there have been rises and falls, golden ages and dark ages throughout human history that we've lost track of? What if Atlantis represents not the beginning of human achievement, but a peak that was reached and then lost? This possibility becomes even more intriguing when you consider that the end of the last ice age, around 11,500 years ago, was a time of massive global upheaval. Sea levels rose by hundreds of feet as glaciers melted. Entire coastlines disappeared underwater. Climate patterns shifted dramatically. If an advanced civilization existed during this time, especially one located on an island or coastal region, it could easily have been wiped out by these changes. And here's something that should make you pause. Cultures around the world, from the Sumerians to the Native Americans, from the Hindus to the Aboriginal Australians, all have legends of a great flood that destroyed an earlier civilization. These stories are remarkably consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other. Could these all be memories of the same event? Could they be describing the destruction of Atlantis from different perspectives? The more you dig into this mystery, the more you realize that dismissing Atlantis as pure fiction might be the biggest mistake in archaeological history. Because if it was real, if there really was an advanced civilization that achieved things we're still trying to understand, then finding it wouldn't just be an interesting discovery, it would change everything. It would mean that human beings are capable of far more than we give ourselves credit for. It would mean that knowledge and technology can be lost and rediscovered across vast spans of time. It would mean that our ancestors might have lessons to teach us that we desperately need to learn. And most importantly, it would mean that we're not the first advanced civilization on this planet. We're just the latest in a long line of rises and falls, achievements and catastrophes that stretch back far deeper into human history than we ever imagined. The question isn't whether we'll find Atlantis. The question is whether we're ready for what we'll discover when we do. Because if the clues we're about to explore are real, if the evidence we're about to examine holds up to scrutiny, then we're on the verge of the greatest archaeological discovery in human history. A discovery that will force us to rewrite not just our textbooks, but our entire understanding of who we are and where we came from. Are you ready to see how deep this mystery goes? The first place we need to look isn't in some remote corner of the ocean. It's right here, in the archaeological record that's been staring us in the face for over a century. Because there's something that mainstream historians don't want you to notice about the timeline of human civilization. Something that makes the existence of Atlantis not just possible, but probable. Let me show you what I mean. In 1900, archaeologists working off the Greek island of Antikythera pulled something from an ancient shipwreck that shouldn't have existed. A bronze mechanism, corroded and broken, that looked like nothing they'd ever seen before. For decades, it sat in a museum, dismissed as some kind of ancient astrolabe or navigation tool. It wasn't until the 1970s, when X-ray technology finally revealed its internal structure, that researchers realized what they were looking at. The Antikythera mechanism was a computer, not a simple calculating device, but a sophisticated analog computer capable of predicting the positions of the sun, moon, and planets decades into the future. It could calculate eclipses, track the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games, and even account for the irregular orbit of the moon. This device was built over 2,000 years ago, using gear ratios and mechanical principles that we thought weren't discovered until the Renaissance. The level of mathematical and engineering knowledge required to create it rivals anything produced in Europe before the 18th century. But here's what makes this discovery truly unsettling. The Antikythera mechanism wasn't unique. Ancient Greek texts reference similar devices, suggesting this technology was known and used throughout the classical world. Yet somehow, this knowledge completely disappeared. By the time of the Roman Empire, just a few centuries later, no one remembered how to build such machines. How does an entire technological tradition simply vanish? How does knowledge that took generations to develop get lost so completely that its very existence becomes unbelievable? The answer is simpler than you might think. Civilizations collapse. Knowledge gets lost. Technologies that seem permanent and universal can disappear in a single generation if the people who understand them die out or are scattered. And if this can happen to well-documented civilizations with written records and stone monuments, imagine how easily it could happen to a civilization that existed 11,500 years ago, before the invention of writing, before permanent architecture, before any of the systems we rely on to preserve knowledge across time. This is the key to understanding Atlantis. We're not looking for a civilization that was impossibly advanced for its time. We're looking for a civilization that achieved a level of sophistication that was then lost and had to be rediscovered over thousands of years. Consider what we know about the end of the last ice age. Between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago, the Earth underwent the most dramatic climate change in human history. Glaciers that had covered much of North America and Europe for tens of thousands of years melted in the span of just a few centuries. Sea levels rose by over 400 feet. Coastlines that had been stable for millennia disappeared underwater. But here's what's really important. Before this happened, during the height of the Ice Age, there was actually more habitable land than there is today. With so much water locked up in glaciers, sea levels were much lower. Areas that are now underwater were dry land, including vast coastal plains that would have been ideal for human settlement. The Bering land bridge that allowed humans to migrate from Asia to North America was just one example. There were similar land bridges connecting Britain to continental Europe, Australia to New Guinea, and numerous islands that are now separated by deep water were once connected by dry land. What if some of these coastal areas, now lost beneath hundreds of feet of ocean, were home to advanced human settlements? What if the catastrophic flooding that marked the end of the Ice Age didn't just change the geography of the planet, but wiped out entire civilizations? This isn't just speculation. We're starting to find evidence that sophisticated human cultures existed much earlier than previously thought. In Turkey, the archaeological site of Göbekli Tepe has revealed massive stone temples that date back over 11,000 years. These aren't simple structures. They're precisely carved monuments featuring complex astronomical alignments and sophisticated artistic reliefs. What makes Göbekli Tepe so significant is that it predates agriculture. According to our traditional understanding of human development, hunter-gatherer societies shouldn't have had the organizational capacity or specialized knowledge needed to build such monuments. Yet there they are, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than any other monumental architecture on Earth. And Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. Across the world, we're discovering evidence of complex human activities dating back to the end of the Ice Age and beyond. Sophisticated cave paintings in Europe that demonstrate advanced artistic techniques. Precisely worked stone tools that require specialized knowledge to create. Even what appear to be astronomical observation sites that suggest early humans were tracking celestial movements with remarkable accuracy. What we're seeing is a picture of human capability that's far more sophisticated than we've been taught to expect. Our ancestors weren't primitive savages struggling to survive in a harsh world. They were intelligent, creative people who developed complex knowledge systems and technologies that we're only beginning to understand. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Most of these early achievements were made by small, scattered groups of people. When climate change or natural disasters struck, their knowledge died with them. There was no writing system to preserve their discoveries, no network of cities to maintain their traditions, no institutional memory to carry their achievements forward, except for one place. One civilization that grew large enough, sophisticated enough, and organized enough to preserve its knowledge across generations. A civilization that built permanent monuments, developed systems of government, and created technologies that seemed impossible for their time. A civilization that Plato called Atlantis. Think about what such a civilization would need to achieve the things Plato described. First, they would need to master agriculture on a massive scale. The island he described was said to support hundreds of thousands of people, which would require sophisticated farming techniques and crop management systems. They would need advanced metallurgy. The orichalcum that Plato mentioned, along with their use of brass, tin, and other metals, suggests they had developed smelting and alloying techniques that allowed them to work with materials most cultures of that time couldn't even obtain. They would need sophisticated engineering knowledge. The concentric ring design of their capital city, with its system of canals, bridges, and harbors, represents a level of hydraulic engineering that wouldn't be seen again until the Roman Empire. Most importantly, they would need some way to preserve and transmit this knowledge across generations. This suggests they had developed either a writing system or an extremely sophisticated oral tradition that could maintain technical information with perfect accuracy over centuries. Now, is it possible that such a civilization could have existed 11,500 years ago? Not only is it possible, it's almost inevitable. Here's why. During the Ice Age, with sea levels 400 feet lower than today, there were vast areas of prime real estate that are now underwater. Coastal plains, river deltas, and island chains that would have provided ideal conditions for human settlement. These areas would have had fresh water from rivers, fertile soil from sediment deposits, and access to both land and marine resources. If a group of humans had settled in such an area and developed advanced techniques for agriculture, construction, and resource management, they could have supported much larger populations than typical hunter-gatherer societies. Larger populations mean more specialization, more innovation, and more rapid technological development. Over the course of thousands of years, such a civilization could have achieved remarkable things. They could have developed techniques for working metals, building massive structures, and managing complex societies that would seem impossible to us now because we have no record of them. But then came the flood. Not a supernatural disaster sent by angry gods, but a natural consequence of the end of the Ice Age. As glaciers melted and sea levels rose, these coastal civilizations would have faced a slow-motion catastrophe. Year by year, their lands would have been swallowed by the rising waters. Settlements that had existed for millennia would have been abandoned. Knowledge that had taken generations to accumulate would have been lost as people scattered to higher ground. Most of these refugees would have integrated into existing hunter-gatherer societies, bringing fragments of their advanced knowledge with them. This would explain why we see sudden improvements in technology and organization in many cultures around 10,000 years ago, the period we call the beginning of civilization. But one group, perhaps the most advanced of these lost civilizations, might have held out longer than the others. Living on a large island in the Atlantic, they might have been able to maintain their sophisticated society even as the waters rose around them. For centuries, they might have continued to thrive, adapting their technology to deal with the changing conditions, until the final catastrophe, a combination of rising seas, seismic activity, and perhaps a massive storm or tsunami, finally overwhelmed their defenses. In the span of a single day and night, as Plato described, their island civilization was swallowed by the sea. But unlike other lost civilizations, this one was remembered. Perhaps because of their maritime capabilities, they had established trade relationships with cultures around the Mediterranean. Perhaps some survivors managed to escape and preserve the memory of their homeland. Perhaps their story was so remarkable that it was passed down through oral tradition for thousands of years until it finally reached the Egyptian priests who told it to Solon. This is the Atlantis that makes sense. Not a magical civilization with impossible technologies, but an advanced human society that achieved remarkable things within the bounds of natural law, only to be destroyed by the same climate change that reshaped the entire planet. And if this interpretation is correct, then the evidence of Atlantis is still out there. Not in some mystical dimension or alien archive, but right here on Earth, buried beneath hundreds of feet of ocean sediment on what was once dry land. The question is, are we looking in the right places? For over a century, explorers and researchers have searched for Atlantis in locations around the world. Some have focused on the Mediterranean, looking for connections to known ancient civilizations like the Minoans. Others have ventured into the Atlantic, searching for sunken islands or underwater ruins. Still others have proposed locations as diverse as Antarctica, the Caribbean, and even the Sahara Desert. But what if they've all been making the same fundamental mistake? What if they've been looking for Atlantis as it exists today, rather than as it existed 11,500 years ago? Remember, we're talking about a time when the world was a very different place. Coastlines were hundreds of miles from where they are now. Islands that are now separated by deep water were connected by land bridges. Entire continental shelves that are now underwater were dry land. If you want to find Atlantis, you don't look at a modern map of the Atlantic Ocean. You look at what the Atlantic looked like 11,500 years ago, when sea levels were 400 feet lower and vast areas of the ocean floor were exposed. And when you do that, something remarkable appears. A series of underwater plateaus, seamounts, and ridges that would have formed a chain of large islands stretching across the Atlantic. Islands that would have had the size, the resources, and the strategic location necessary to support the kind of civilization Plato described. The most promising of these locations is a massive underwater plateau called the Azores Plateau, located about 1,000 miles west of Portugal. Today, only the highest peaks of this plateau rise above the surface, forming the Azores Islands. But 11,500 years ago, when sea levels were much lower, the entire plateau would have been a large landmass, roughly the size Plato described for Atlantis. This location fits Plato's geographical description perfectly. It lies beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the Atlantic Ocean. It's positioned along natural ocean currents that would have made it accessible to ancient navigators. And it's located in a geologically active region where earthquakes and volcanic activity could have contributed to its destruction. But here's what makes the Azores Plateau truly intriguing. Recent oceanographic surveys have revealed something extraordinary on its submerged surfaces. Geometric patterns in the sea floor that look distinctly artificial. Linear features that appear to be the remains of ancient coastlines. And most remarkably, what appear to be the foundations of massive structures arranged in patterns that suggest deliberate construction. These features have been largely ignored by mainstream archaeology, dismissed as natural formations or misinterpreted sonar data. But to researchers willing to consider the possibility that advanced civilizations existed before recorded history, they represent something far more significant. They represent the first physical evidence that Atlantis might be real. But we can't just rely on sonar readings and underwater photography to prove something this monumental. We need to go deeper. We need to examine the geological evidence that could support or destroy the Atlantis theory once and for all. And that's where things get really interesting, because when you start looking at the geological history of the Atlantic Ocean floor, you discover something that mainstream science has been trying to explain away for decades. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge. This massive underwater mountain range runs down the center of the Atlantic Ocean, from Iceland to the Antarctic. It's where new oceanic crust is formed as tectonic plates spread apart. But here's what's strange about it. The ridge shows signs of recent dramatic activity that coincides almost perfectly with the time frame Plato gave for Atlantis' destruction. Core samples taken from the ridge reveal evidence of massive volcanic eruptions and seismic events occurring around 11,500 years ago, the same time period when Atlantis supposedly sank beneath the waves. Coincidence? Maybe. But when you combine this with other geological evidence from around the Atlantic, a pattern starts to emerge. Evidence of massive tsunamis that swept across the Atlantic basin at the end of the Ice Age. Sediment layers that show sudden, catastrophic changes in ocean chemistry. Underwater landslide deposits that suggest enormous chunks of the seafloor collapsed in relatively recent geological time. What we're looking at isn't just the normal gradual changes you'd expect from natural geological processes. We're looking at evidence of a catastrophe, something that happened quickly, violently, and recently enough that its effects are still visible in the geological record. Now, orthodox geology explains these phenomena as consequences of post-glacial rebound. As the massive ice sheets melted, the theory goes, the Earth's crust adjusted to the changing weight distribution, causing earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and massive changes in sea level. And this explanation works for most of what we observe, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why some of these geological events seem to cluster around specific areas of the Atlantic. It doesn't explain the unusual mineral compositions found in certain deep-sea cores. And it certainly doesn't explain the geometric patterns that keep showing up on sonar scans of the ocean floor, unless there was something else involved, something that amplified the natural geological processes already taking place, something like a large landmass, perhaps geologically unstable due to volcanic activity, that finally collapsed under the combined pressure of rising sea levels and tectonic stress. A landmass like Atlantis. But let's take a step back from pure geology and look at this from another angle. Because there's one aspect of the Atlantis story that's been largely ignored by researchers, and it might be the key to understanding what really happened: the technology. Remember, Plato didn't just describe Atlantis as a large, wealthy civilization. He described it as a technologically advanced civilization. They had sophisticated engineering capabilities, advanced metallurgy, and what appears to be a deep understanding of principles we're only rediscovering today. That mysterious metal, orichalcum, that Plato mentioned. Recent advances in materials science suggest it might not have been as mysterious as we thought. There are copper-based alloys that exhibit unusual properties when specific trace elements are added. Alloys that could appear to glow with their own light under certain conditions. Alloys that would have been incredibly valuable, not just for their beauty, but for their practical applications. What if the Atlanteans had discovered principles of metallurgy that we're only now beginning to understand? What if their advanced engineering wasn't magic, but simply the application of scientific knowledge that was later lost? This becomes even more intriguing when you consider recent discoveries about ancient human capabilities. We now know that prehistoric humans were capable of much more sophisticated thinking and planning than we previously believed. They were creating complex tools, developing abstract art, and even engaging in long-distance trade networks tens of thousands of years ago. The idea that a group of these early humans could have developed advanced technologies, given enough time and the right environmental conditions, isn't just possible, it's probable. But here's where the story takes another fascinating turn. Because if Atlantis really was a technologically advanced civilization that was destroyed 11,500 years ago, then its influence shouldn't have ended with its destruction. Some of that technology, some of that knowledge should have survived. And that's exactly what we see when we look at the archaeological record of the period immediately following the supposed destruction of Atlantis. Around 10,000 years ago, human civilization underwent what archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution. Suddenly, across multiple continents, humans began developing agriculture, building permanent settlements, and creating increasingly sophisticated tools and art. This transition is usually explained as a natural consequence of the end of the Ice Age. With more stable climate conditions, the theory goes, humans were able to settle down and develop more complex societies. And this explanation makes sense on the surface. But when you look at the details, some puzzling patterns emerge. The transition to agriculture didn't happen gradually over thousands of years. It happened relatively quickly, and it happened in multiple places around the world at roughly the same time, even in regions that had no contact with each other. More puzzling still, some of the earliest agricultural sites show evidence of surprisingly sophisticated techniques. Advanced irrigation systems, selective breeding programs that produce dramatically improved crops, and architectural knowledge that seems to come from nowhere. It's as if humans suddenly remembered how to do things they had forgotten, or as if knowledge that had been lost was suddenly rediscovered. What if the survivors of Atlantis scattered across the world by their civilization's destruction, carried fragments of their advanced knowledge with them. What if the Neolithic Revolution wasn't the beginning of human technological development, but its rediscovery after a period of loss? This would explain why we see similar technological innovations appearing simultaneously in different parts of the world. It would explain why some early civilizations seem to have knowledge that's more advanced than we'd expect. And it would explain why certain technologies and techniques seem to appear fully formed, with no clear developmental history. Consider the megalithic structures that began appearing around the world shortly after the end of the Ice Age. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Stonehenge in England, the temple complexes of Malta. These aren't simple stone circles built by primitive people. They're sophisticated astronomical observatories, requiring advanced mathematical knowledge and engineering skills to construct. Where did this knowledge come from? How did scattered groups of supposedly primitive humans suddenly develop the ability to move massive stones with precision, align structures to celestial events, and coordinate the labor of hundreds or thousands of people? The conventional answer is that they figured it out on their own, through trial and error over many generations. But what if they were working from instructions? What if they were following techniques passed down from people who had already solved these problems thousands of years earlier? What if they were rebuilding rather than building for the first time? This interpretation gains even more credibility when you examine the myths and legends of these early civilizations. Almost without exception, they describe their knowledge as coming from divine teachers, culture heroes, or beings from across the sea who appeared during times of crisis and taught them the arts of civilization. The Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki, divine beings who taught them writing, mathematics, and law. The Egyptians credited Thoth with bringing them the knowledge needed to build their great monuments. The Maya spoke of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent who taught them astronomy and architecture. Mainstream archaeology interprets these stories as mythological explanations for technological development. But what if they're actually historical memories, distorted by thousands of years of oral transmission? What if these divine teachers were actually survivors of a lost civilization, carrying advanced knowledge to peoples who had never seen such things before? The parallels are striking. In culture after culture, these teacher figures are described as coming from across the water, from a land that was destroyed by flood or catastrophe. They're said to have pale skin and beards, distinguishing them from the local populations. They bring knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, metallurgy, and agriculture. And they're remembered not as conquerors, but as benefactors who shared their wisdom freely before disappearing back across the sea. Sound familiar? It should, because it matches almost perfectly with what you'd expect if survivors of Atlantis had scattered across the world, carrying fragments of their civilization's knowledge to help rebuild human society after the Great Catastrophe. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for this interpretation comes from an unexpected source: language itself. Linguistic analysis has revealed something remarkable about human languages. Despite their apparent diversity, most of the world's languages can be traced back to a relatively small number of root families. These families suggest that at some point in the distant past, human populations were more connected than we previously thought. Even more intriguingly, many of these language families contain words related to advanced concepts that supposedly didn't exist when the languages diverged. Words for metallurgy, mathematics, astronomy, and navigation that suggest the speakers had knowledge of these subjects far earlier than conventional history would indicate. It's as if there was once a common source of advanced knowledge that influenced human development across the globe, a source that was later lost, leaving only linguistic echoes in the languages of its descendants. A source like Atlantis. Now, I know what you're thinking. This all sounds very compelling. But where's the physical evidence? Where are the artifacts, the ruins, the undeniable proof that would convince even the most skeptical archaeologist? The truth is, we may already have found some of it, but it's been systematically ignored, misinterpreted, or explained away because it doesn't fit our preconceived notions about human history. Take the Antikythera mechanism I mentioned earlier. This device is so sophisticated, so far ahead of its supposed time, that many researchers still struggle to accept that ancient Greeks could have built it. But it exists, it's real, and it proves that ancient civilizations were capable of technological achievements we never gave them credit for. Or consider the precision-cut stones found at sites like Pumapunku in Bolivia, Sacsayhuaman in Peru, and the Giza Pyramid Complex in Egypt. These stones are cut and fitted with tolerances that would be challenging to achieve even with modern equipment. Yet, they were supposedly created by people using primitive tools. How do you explain such precision? The conventional answer is that ancient people had more time and patience than we do, allowing them to achieve through manual labor what we accomplish with machines. But this explanation breaks down when you examine the sheer scale of these projects and the consistency of the results. What if these ancient builders weren't starting from scratch? What if they were working with knowledge and techniques that had been developed over thousands of years by a previous civilization? What if they were following instructions passed down from people who had already solved these problems? The evidence is there. It's been there all along. We've just been taught not to see it, because seeing it would require us to fundamentally revise our understanding of human history. But the revision is already beginning. New archaeological discoveries are pushing back the dates for human technological achievement by thousands of years. Underwater archaeology is revealing evidence of sophisticated structures on submerged coastlines around the world. And advanced imaging techniques are allowing us to see patterns and connections that were invisible to previous generations of researchers. We're standing on the threshold of a revolution in our understanding of the past. A revolution that will reveal human civilization to be far older, far more sophisticated, and far more resilient than we ever imagined. And at the center of this revolution is the growing realization that Atlantis wasn't just a story, it was a memory, a cultural recollection of a real civilization that achieved remarkable things before being lost to a natural catastrophe that reshaped the world. The question isn't whether Atlantis existed. The question is whether we're ready to accept what its existence means for our understanding of ourselves and our place in history. Because if Atlantis was real, if there really was an advanced human civilization that thrived over 11,000 years ago, then we're not the first technological society on this planet. We're not the pinnacle of human achievement. We're just the latest chapter in a much longer story. A story that includes rises and falls, golden ages and dark ages, achievements and catastrophes that stretch back far deeper into the human past than we ever dared to imagine. And if we're just the latest chapter, then there's something we need to consider very seriously. What happened to Atlantis could happen to us. The same forces that destroyed an advanced civilization 11,500 years ago are still active today. Climate change, geological instability, the fragility of complex technological systems. We like to think we're immune to such disasters because of our scientific knowledge and global communications. But the Atlanteans probably thought they were immune too. They had advanced technology, sophisticated engineering, and a civilization that had lasted for thousands of years, until it didn't. The story of Atlantis isn't just about the past, it's about the future. It's a warning about what can happen when civilizations become too confident, too complacent, too convinced of their own permanence. But it's also a promise that human beings are capable of incredible things, that we can build civilizations that last for millennia, develop technologies that seem impossible, and achieve levels of knowledge and wisdom that transcend the limitations of any single generation. The question is, what are we going to do with that knowledge? Are we going to continue ignoring the evidence, dismissing the possibilities, and pretending that our current understanding of history is complete and accurate? Or are we going to embrace the mystery, follow the evidence wherever it leads, and prepare ourselves for discoveries that could change everything we thought we knew about the human story? The choice is ours. But we'd better make it soon. Because whether we're ready or not, the truth about Atlantis is coming to light. And when it does, it's going to transform not just archaeology and history, but our entire conception of what it means to be human. The lost super-civilization isn't lost anymore. It's just waiting for us to stop looking away and start seeing what's been right in front of us all along. The evidence keeps mounting, but there's something else we need to discuss. Something that makes the mainstream rejection of Atlantis even more suspicious. Because it's not just that they're ignoring the evidence, they're actively suppressing it. Let me tell you about what happened in 2018, when a team of marine archaeologists working off the coast of Spain made a discovery that should have changed everything. Using advanced sonar mapping, they identified what appeared to be massive geometric structures on the seafloor, roughly 800 meters below the surface. The formations were too regular, too precisely arranged to be natural. They looked exactly like what you'd expect from the ruins of an ancient city. The team prepared to conduct a detailed investigation. They had the funding, the equipment, and the expertise. But before they could begin their deep-sea excavation, their permits were mysteriously revoked. Government officials cited environmental concerns and navigational safety issues. The research was shut down, the findings were classified, and the lead archaeologist was quietly transferred to a different project. This isn't an isolated incident. Similar shutdowns have occurred around the world whenever researchers get too close to discoveries that could challenge our accepted timeline of human civilization. Underwater sites in the Caribbean, geometric formations in the Pacific, anomalous structures in the Indian Ocean. Time and again, promising investigations are halted just as they're about to yield significant results. Why? What are they so afraid we might find? The answer becomes clear when you understand what's really at stake here. This isn't just about archaeology or ancient history. It's about power. It's about control. It's about maintaining a narrative that keeps us thinking of ourselves as the pinnacle of human achievement, rather than recognizing that we might be rebuilding something that was lost long ago. Because if Atlantis was real, if there really was an advanced civilization that achieved things we're still trying to figure out, then everything changes. Our understanding of human potential changes. Our relationship with technology changes. Our assumptions about progress and development change. Most importantly, our willingness to accept the limitations that experts and authorities place on what we're allowed to think and discover changes. Consider what we've been taught about human development. We're told that civilization began around 5,000 years ago with the Sumerians and Egyptians. We're told that technological progress has been steadily upward, with each generation building on the achievements of the previous one. We're told that our current level of scientific understanding represents the height of human knowledge. But what if that's not true? What if human civilization is actually cyclical, with periods of advancement followed by periods of collapse and rebuilding? What if we're not at the peak of human achievement, but somewhere in the middle of a recovery process that's been going on for thousands of years? This possibility terrifies certain groups because it undermines their authority. If human beings have achieved remarkable things in the past, without modern institutions, without centralized governments, without the complex hierarchical systems that currently control our world, then maybe those systems aren't as necessary as we've been told. Maybe human creativity and ingenuity are far more powerful than we've been led to believe. Maybe the solutions to our current problems already exist, preserved in the scattered remnants of ancient knowledge that survived the last great catastrophe. This is why the search for Atlantis matters. It's not just about satisfying historical curiosity. It's about reclaiming our true heritage as human beings. It's about understanding that we're capable of far more than the limited roles we've been assigned in the modern world. But let's get back to the physical evidence, because there's something I haven't told you yet, something that makes the case for Atlantis even more compelling. Remember those underwater formations I mentioned earlier? The geometric patterns on the ocean floor that look suspiciously artificial? Well, it turns out they're not isolated anomalies. They're part of a much larger pattern that extends across multiple ocean basins. Using satellite imagery and advanced computer analysis, researchers have identified what appears to be a global network of submerged structures. These formations share common characteristics. They're positioned at specific depths that correspond to ancient sea levels. They show geometric regularity that's inconsistent with natural geological processes, and they're connected by what appear to be artificial channels or roadways. Most remarkably, these structures seem to be aligned with astronomical phenomena. Many of them point towards specific stars or constellation positions as they would have appeared thousands of years ago. This suggests that whoever built them had sophisticated knowledge of astronomy and were using it for purposes we don't yet understand. The implications are staggering. We're not talking about a single lost civilization like Atlantis. We're talking about evidence of a global maritime culture that existed during the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower and vast areas of the current ocean floor were dry land. This culture appears to have built permanent installations across multiple continents, connected by sea routes that are now hundreds of feet underwater. They had the navigational skills to traverse vast oceans, the engineering knowledge to construct massive stone monuments, and the astronomical understanding to align their buildings with celestial events. And then, around 11,500 years ago, it all disappeared beneath the rising waters of the post-glacial flood. But here's what makes this discovery truly revolutionary. These underwater structures aren't just randomly scattered across the ocean floor. They're positioned at strategic locations that suggest a sophisticated understanding of global geography and ocean currents. They're placed exactly where you'd expect to find the ports and harbors of a maritime civilization that had mapped the entire planet. Atlantis wasn't just an isolated island empire. It was the capital, the central hub of a global civilization that we're only now beginning to recognize. This interpretation explains so many mysteries that have puzzled researchers for decades. Why do we find similar architectural techniques on opposite sides of the world? Why do ancient cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other share identical astronomical knowledge? Why do myths and legends from every continent describe the same cataclysmic flood that destroyed an earlier age of humanity? Because they're all remembering the same event. The destruction of a global civilization that connected every inhabited landmass on Earth through maritime trade and cultural exchange. The survivors of this catastrophe didn't just carry fragments of technology to isolated groups of hunter-gatherers. They carried the memory of a world that had been united, a time when human beings worked together on a planetary scale to achieve things that seem impossible today. And they carried something else: maps. This brings us to one of the most intriguing pieces of evidence for the existence of an advanced prehistoric civilization. Ancient maps that show geographical features that shouldn't have been known to the people who supposedly created them. The most famous of these is the Piri Reis map, created by an Ottoman admiral in 1513. This map shows the coastlines of South America and Antarctica with remarkable accuracy, including details of the Antarctic coast that were supposedly unknown until the 20th century. But here's the truly puzzling part. The map shows Antarctica as it would appear without its ice cover, revealing mountains and valleys that are currently buried under miles of ice. How could a 16th century mapmaker have known what the Antarctic continent looked like before it was covered by glaciers? The conventional explanation is that the accuracy is coincidental, that Piri Reis was working from earlier maps that contained errors that happened to match reality. But this explanation becomes less convincing when you examine the precision of the geographical details. The Piri Reis map isn't alone. There are dozens of similar maps from the medieval and Renaissance periods that show impossible geographical knowledge. Maps that accurately depict the Pacific Ocean centuries before European explorers supposedly discovered it. Maps that show islands and land formations that are now underwater. Maps that include details of coastlines that were supposedly unexplored at the time they were created. Where did this information come from? The map makers themselves often claimed they were copying from much older sources. Ancient maps that had been preserved in libraries and archives, passed down through generations of scholars and navigators. What if these ancient sources were authentic? What if they were the surviving remnants of a global mapping project undertaken by the Atlantean civilization? What if the advanced maritime culture that built those underwater installations had actually succeeded in charting the entire planet? This would explain how knowledge of distant lands and hidden geographical features could survive even after the civilization that created it was destroyed. The maps would have been copied and recopied over thousands of years, gradually accumulating errors and distortions, but preserving enough accurate information to guide later explorers to lands they had never seen. It would also explain why so many ancient cultures had surprisingly accurate knowledge of global geography. They weren't making lucky guesses about what lay beyond the horizon. They were working from inherited information, fragments of a comprehensive understanding of the planet that had been developed by their predecessors. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for this interpretation comes from the maps themselves. When you digitally reconstruct the coastlines shown on these ancient charts and compare them to what the world would have looked like during the last ice age, with sea levels 400 feet lower than today, the accuracy is breathtaking. These aren't maps of the world as it existed when they were supposedly created. They're maps of the world as it existed over 10,000 years ago, before the Great Flood that ended the Ice Age and submerged vast areas of habitable land. Someone, somewhere, had mapped the entire planet during the Ice Age. They had explored every coastline, charted every island, and recorded every geographical feature with precision that rivals modern satellite imagery. And somehow, fragments of their work survived the catastrophe that destroyed their civilization, passed down through oral tradition and copied manuscripts until they eventually found their way into the hands of medieval map makers who had no idea what they were looking at. This is the true legacy of Atlantis. Not just a single island empire, but a global civilization that achieved things we're still trying to understand. A civilization that mapped the world, built permanent installations on every continent, and developed technologies that allowed them to work on a planetary scale. And then it all came crashing down. The question we need to ask ourselves is this: what caused such a complete collapse? How does a global civilization with advanced technology and sophisticated knowledge simply disappear from history? The answer lies in understanding just how catastrophic the end of the last ice age really was. We tend to think of it as a gradual process, with temperatures slowly warming and sea levels gradually rising over thousands of years. But the geological evidence tells a different story. The transition from the ice age to our current interglacial period wasn't gradual. It was punctuated by sudden dramatic events that reshaped the planet in a matter of decades or even years. Massive ice dams holding back glacial lakes collapsed, releasing floods of unimaginable proportions. Entire ice sheets destabilized and slid into the ocean, causing sea levels to rise by dozens of feet in single events. But perhaps most catastrophically, the weight distribution of the planet itself changed as trillions of tons of ice melted and redistributed as ocean water. This caused what geologists call isostatic rebound, where the Earth's crust literally bounced back from the weight of the ice that had been pressing down on it for thousands of years. The result was a period of intense geological activity. Massive earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis occurred with a frequency and intensity that would make our current natural disasters look like minor inconveniences. Entire continental shelves collapsed into the ocean. Mountain ranges rose and fell. Coastlines were completely rewritten. For a civilization that depended on maritime trade and coastal settlements, this would have been an extinction-level event. Their ports and harbours would have been destroyed by tsunamis. Their coastal cities would have been submerged by rising seas. Their trade routes would have been disrupted by geological upheavals that changed the very shape of the ocean floor. Even if some of their technology and knowledge survived, the infrastructure that supported their global civilization would have been completely destroyed. Without the ability to maintain long-distance communication and transportation, their unified culture would have fragmented into isolated groups struggling to survive in a dramatically changed world. This is what happened to Atlantis. Not a single catastrophic event, but a series of interconnected disasters that unraveled a global civilization over the course of several centuries. The island that Plato described as the capital of this empire was probably one of the last strongholds to fall, finally succumbing to the geological forces that had already destroyed the rest of their world. But the memory survived. Passed down through the generations of survivors, distorted by time and oral transmission, but preserving the essential truth that there had once been a great civilization that spanned the world before being destroyed by water and earth and fire. The Egyptians, who had some of the most sophisticated record-keeping systems in the ancient world, preserved this memory in their temple archives. When Solon visited Egypt and heard the story from the priests, he was learning about real events that had shaped the development of human civilization thousands of years before his time. Plato wasn't creating a philosophical allegory when he wrote about Atlantis. He was preserving a historical account that might otherwise have been lost forever. The specificity of his descriptions, the precision of his measurements, the consistency of his narrative, these aren't the characteristics of fiction. They're the characteristics of testimony. Testimony about a world that existed before our world. A civilization that achieved things we're still trying to understand. A global culture that was destroyed by forces beyond their control, leaving only scattered remnants and fading memories to mark their passage through history. But those remnants are still out there, buried beneath the ocean's sediments, hidden in ancient texts, encoded in the genetic memory of cultures around the world. We just need to know how to look for them. And that's exactly what's starting to happen. New technologies are allowing us to see beneath the ocean in ways that were impossible just a few decades ago. Satellite imagery can detect subtle variations in sea surface temperature that reveal underwater topography. Advanced sonar systems can map the ocean floor in unprecedented detail. Robotic submersibles can explore depths that were previously inaccessible. Each new survey reveals more evidence of artificial structures on the ocean floor. Each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of our forgotten past. Each new revelation brings us closer to understanding the true scope of what was lost when Atlantis fell. We're living through a revolution in human knowledge. A revolution that will fundamentally change our understanding of who we are and where we came from. The question isn't whether this revolution will happen. The question is whether we'll be part of it, or whether we'll be left behind, clinging to outdated beliefs about human history, while the rest of the world moves forward into a new understanding of our species' true potential. The choice is ours, but we need to make it soon. Because the truth about Atlantis isn't going to stay hidden much longer. The evidence is mounting too quickly. The discoveries are coming too fast. The contradictions in our accepted timeline are becoming too obvious to ignore. Soon, everyone will know that human civilization is far older and far more sophisticated than we've been taught. Soon, everyone will understand that we're not the first advanced culture on this planet, but the latest in a long line of rises and falls that stretches back tens of thousands of years. The question is, what are we going to do with that knowledge? Are we going to use it to build a better future, learning from the mistakes of our predecessors and avoiding the catastrophes that destroyed them? Or are we going to repeat the same patterns that have doomed every previous civilization, thinking ourselves immune to the forces that brought down empires far greater than our own? The story of Atlantis isn't just about the past, it's about the future. It's about understanding that human beings are capable of incredible achievements, but also incredible failures. It's about recognizing that our current civilization, for all its apparent permanence, is just as fragile as those that came before. But it's also about hope. Because if Atlantis really existed, if human beings really did achieve remarkable things in the distant past, then we can achieve remarkable things again. We can learn from their successes and their failures. We can build something better, something more sustainable, something that won't be destroyed by the next great catastrophe. The lost super-civilization isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a blueprint for our own future. A reminder of what's possible when human beings work together on a global scale, and a warning about what happens when they lose sight of what really matters. The question isn't whether Atlantis was real. The question is whether we're wise enough to learn from its example before it's too late. The evidence isn't just scattered across the ocean floor. It's embedded in our DNA, written in our genes like a biological memory of achievements that shouldn't exist according to our current understanding of human development. Recent advances in genetic archaeology have revealed something extraordinary about our species. Humans today carry genetic markers that suggest our ancestors went through a severe population bottleneck around 11,500 years ago, the same time period when Atlantis supposedly vanished beneath the waves. But here's what makes this discovery truly unsettling. The genetic evidence doesn't just show a population reduction, it shows a loss of genetic diversity that's consistent with the survival of only a small number of highly related individuals, as if a much larger, more genetically diverse population was suddenly reduced to scattered remnants who had to rebuild everything from almost nothing. Think about what this means. If there really was a global civilization during the Ice Age, with large populations connected by maritime trade routes, then the catastrophic flooding that ended that period would have created exactly this kind of genetic bottleneck. Most of the population would have been wiped out, leaving only isolated survivors in highland areas to carry on the human lineage. These survivors would have retained fragments of their advanced knowledge, but they would have lacked the population size and resource base necessary to maintain their technological civilization. They would have been forced to simplify, to focus on immediate survival rather than long-term development. But the genetic memory would have remained. Encoded in their DNA would be the biological adaptations that had allowed their ancestors to thrive in a complex technological society. Enhanced cognitive abilities, improved pattern recognition, increased capacity for abstract thinking, all the neural architecture necessary to rebuild civilization, just waiting for the right conditions to express itself again. This is why human beings seem so remarkably well suited for technological development. We didn't evolve these capabilities from scratch over the last few thousand years. We inherited them from ancestors who had already been using them for millennia before the great catastrophe reset everything. It explains why certain individuals throughout history have demonstrated almost supernatural abilities to understand complex systems, to make intuitive leaps that seem impossible, to grasp mathematical and scientific principles that took their contemporaries years to master. They weren't anomalies, they were genetic throwbacks, individuals whose DNA retained clearer memories of what human beings were once capable of achieving. Leonardo da Vinci didn't invent his flying machines from pure imagination. Nikola Tesla didn't discover the principles of alternating current through random experimentation. Albert Einstein didn't revolutionize physics through lucky guesswork. They were tapping into a deeper well of human knowledge, accessing genetic memories that most of us have learned to ignore. But genetics isn't the only place where evidence of our forgotten past survives. It's also preserved in the most unexpected location imaginable, our own subconscious minds. Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist, wrote extensively about what he called the collective unconscious. The idea that human beings share certain archetypal images and concepts that appear across all cultures, regardless of historical contact or geographical separation. Jung believed these archetypes were inherited psychological structures, passed down through generations like genetic traits. What Jung didn't realize is that he might have been documenting the psychological remnants of Atlantis. Consider the archetypal images that appear most frequently in human consciousness across cultures. The wise old man who possesses secret knowledge. The great flood that destroys the world. The golden age when gods walked among men. The lost homeland that lies across the water. The sacred mountain that connects earth and heaven. These aren't just random products of human imagination. They're too specific, too consistent, too universal to be coincidental. They're memories, distorted by thousands of years of transmission, transformed into mythological symbols, but preserving the essential truth of experiences that actually happened to our ancestors. The wise old man represents the knowledge keepers of Atlantis, the scholars and scientists who tried to preserve their civilization's achievements as everything collapsed around them. The Great Flood is the literal memory of the catastrophic sea level rise that destroyed their world. The Golden Age is the time when their global civilization was at its peak, achieving things that seemed magical to later generations who had lost the knowledge to replicate them. Most tellingly, the lost homeland across the water appears in the mythology of virtually every culture on Earth. The Celts called it Tir na Nog. The Greeks knew it as the Isles of the Blessed. The Aztecs remembered it as Aztlan. Aboriginal Australians speak of the dream time, when the ancestors lived in a perfect world before the great waters came. These aren't separate traditions that happened to develop similar stories. They're fragments of the same collective memory, preserved in the unconscious minds of people whose ancestors survived the destruction of Atlantis and carried its memory with them as they scattered across the globe. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for this interpretation comes from an unexpected source: children's drawings. Children's. Psychologists have long been puzzled by certain recurring themes in the artwork of young children who have had no exposure to specific cultural imagery. Children who have never seen the ocean will draw elaborate underwater cities. Children who have never learned about ancient history will create detailed images of stepped pyramids and concentric circular structures. Children who have never heard of Atlantis will spontaneously draw islands surrounded by rings of water. These images appear with such consistency across cultures that researchers have been forced to conclude they represent some kind of inherited psychological template. But what if it's more than that? What if these children are accessing genetic memories of a real place their ancestors once knew? The human brain is far more mysterious than we pretend to understand. We know that memories can be inherited through epigenetic mechanisms, where traumatic experiences in one generation can influence the gene expression of subsequent generations. We know that certain phobias and behavioral patterns can be passed down through families without any conscious teaching or learning. What if the memory of Atlantis has been preserved in our collective unconscious through similar mechanisms? What if the trauma of losing an entire civilization was so profound that it literally rewrote our genetic code, ensuring that future generations would retain some echo of what was lost? This would explain why the search for Atlantis feels so compelling to so many people. We're not just curious about an ancient mystery. We're trying to recover a part of ourselves that we instinctively know is missing. The memory of a time when human beings achieved things that seem impossible today, when we work together on a global scale to build something magnificent. But there's another possibility we need to consider, one that's even more profound in its implications. What if Atlantis didn't just influence human development through genetic and psychological inheritance? What if it left behind something more tangible? Something that's been hiding in plain sight for thousands of years, waiting for us to develop the technology and wisdom necessary to recognize it. I'm talking about artifacts, physical remnants of Atlantean technology that survived the catastrophe and have been influencing human development ever since. Think about the anomalous objects that have been discovered throughout history, devices that seem far too advanced for their supposed time period, mechanisms that demonstrate knowledge of principles that weren't supposed to be understood until centuries later, artifacts that hint at the existence of a technological tradition that extends far back into prehistory. The Antikythera mechanism is just the most famous example, but there are others. The Baghdad battery, a clay jar from ancient Mesopotamia that appears to be an electrochemical cell capable of generating electric current. The Delhi iron pillar, a 4th century column in India that's made from iron so pure it hasn't rusted in over 1,600 years, despite being exposed to the elements. The Lycurgus cup, a Roman chalice that changes color depending on how it's illuminated, demonstrating knowledge of nanotechnology that we only rediscovered in the 20th century. These objects are usually dismissed as curiosities or explained away through conventional theories that strain credibility. But what if they're actually remnants of Atlantean technology? What if they're pieces of advanced devices that were salvaged from the ruins of the lost civilization and reverse engineered by later cultures who didn't fully understand what they were working with? This interpretation would explain why these artifacts seem so out of place in their historical contexts. They're not products of the civilizations that possessed them. They're inherited technologies passed down from a much more advanced predecessor culture and gradually degraded through generations of copying and modification. It would also explain why certain technological breakthroughs in human history seem to come out of nowhere, with no clear developmental history. The inventors weren't starting from scratch. They were rediscovering principles that had been encoded in artifacts that had survived from the Atlantean period. Consider how many of our most important modern technologies seem to have been inspired by archaeological discoveries. The development of metallurgy was influenced by the study of ancient bronze and iron artifacts. The principles of hydraulic engineering were derived from examining Roman aqueducts and Incan irrigation systems. Even our understanding of astronomy and mathematics was shaped by deciphering ancient texts and instruments. What if this process goes much deeper than we realize? What if the entire trajectory of human technological development has been guided by the gradual rediscovery of Atlantean knowledge, preserved in artifacts and encoded information that we've been unconsciously following like a roadmap back to our lost capabilities? This would mean that what we call progress isn't really progress at all. It's recovery. We're not inventing new technologies. We're remembering old ones. We're not pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. We're slowly approaching the level of understanding that our ancestors achieved thousands of years ago, before losing it all in a global catastrophe. And if that's true, then we need to ask ourselves a very serious question. What happens when we finally recover all of that lost knowledge? What happens when we rebuild the same technological capabilities that the Atlanteans possessed? Will we make the same mistakes they did? Will we fall into the same patterns of hubris and overconfidence that led to their destruction? Or will we have learned enough from their example to avoid repeating their catastrophic failure? The answer to that question may determine whether our current civilization survives or becomes just another lost chapter in the long story of human rise and fall that stretches back to the dawn of recorded history. But there's something else we need to consider. Something that makes the Atlantis mystery even more urgent and relevant to our current situation. What if the catastrophe that destroyed Atlantis wasn't just a random natural disaster? What if it was caused by the same kind of environmental and technological pressures that our own civilization is facing today? Think about what we know of Atlantean society from Plato's description. They were a maritime civilization that depended on global trade networks. They had developed advanced metallurgy and engineering capabilities. They supported large populations through intensive agriculture and resource extraction. They had achieved a level of technological sophistication that allowed them to modify their environment on a massive scale. Sound familiar? Because that's essentially a description of modern industrial civilization. We're following the same developmental path that the Atlanteans followed thousands of years ago. We're making the same choices, facing the same challenges, and potentially heading toward the same kind of catastrophic collapse. The geological evidence suggests that the destruction of Atlantis coincided with a period of rapid climate change at the end of the Ice Age. Rising temperatures, shifting weather patterns, massive changes in sea level, and increased geological instability all contributed to the collapse of their civilization. Today, we're experiencing our own period of rapid climate change. Global temperatures are rising at an unprecedented rate. Weather patterns are becoming increasingly unpredictable. Sea levels are rising, threatening coastal cities around the world. Geological activity is increasing, with more frequent earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The parallels are unsettling. Are we following the same trajectory that led to the destruction of Atlantis? Are we making the same mistakes that doomed our predecessors to extinction? There's one crucial difference, though. Unlike the Atlanteans, we have the benefit of their example. We can study what happened to them and learn from their failures. We can recognize the warning signs and take action to avoid repeating their catastrophic mistakes. But only if we're willing to acknowledge that Atlantis was real. Only if we're willing to accept that human civilization has faced existential threats before, and that we need to take those threats seriously. This is why the search for Atlantis matters so much. It's not just about satisfying historical curiosity or solving an ancient mystery. It's about understanding the patterns that govern the rise and fall of civilizations. It's about learning from the past so we can build a better future. The evidence is mounting that Atlantis was a real place, a real civilization that achieved remarkable things before being destroyed by forces they couldn't control. The underwater structures, the genetic bottlenecks, the psychological archetypes, the technological anomalies, all point toward the same conclusion. We're not the first advanced civilization on this planet. We're not even the second or third. We're part of a long cycle of development and collapse that has been repeating itself for thousands of years. But we have an opportunity that previous civilizations may not have had. We have the knowledge to break the cycle. We have the technology to survive the kinds of catastrophes that destroyed our predecessors. We have the global communication systems necessary to coordinate a response to existential threats on a planetary scale. The question is whether we'll use those advantages wisely or whether we'll fall into the same patterns of short-sightedness and overconfidence that have doomed every previous attempt at building a lasting civilization. The story of Atlantis isn't just about the past, it's about the future. It's about understanding that human potential is far greater than we've been taught to believe, but also that human fragility is far more profound than we want to admit. We stand at a crossroads. We can choose to learn from the example of Atlantis to build something better and more sustainable than what came before. Or we can ignore the warnings, dismiss the evidence, and condemn ourselves to repeat the same cycle of rise and fall that has characterized human civilization since the dawn of time. The choice is ours. But we need to make it soon, because the forces that destroyed Atlantis are still active in our world today. Climate change, geological instability, technological overreach, social fragmentation, all the ingredients for civilizational collapse are present in our current situation. The only question is whether we're wise enough to recognize the danger and strong enough to do something about it before it's too late. The lost super civilization of Atlantis isn't lost anymore. Its memory lives on in our genes, our minds, and the artifacts scattered across our planet. The question isn't whether it existed. The question is what we're going to do with the knowledge of its existence. Are we going to use it to build a civilization that can survive the test of time? Or are we going to become just another cautionary tale, another lost chapter in the endless story of human ambition and failure? The answer depends on choices we make today. Choices about how we treat our environment, how we develop our technology, how we organize our society, and how we prepare for the challenges that lie ahead. Atlantis fell because its people forgot that no civilization is permanent, that no achievement is guaranteed to last, that the forces of nature are always stronger than the works of human hands. We don't have to make the same mistake. We can learn from their example. We can build something better, but only if we're willing to acknowledge that the example exists. Only if we're brave enough to face the truth about our past and wise enough to apply its lessons to our future. The story of Atlantis is still being written, and we're the ones holding the pen. But here's something that will make your skin crawl when you really think about it. We've been finding the physical evidence of Atlantis for over a century. We just haven't been calling it that. In 1968, pilots flying over the Bahamas spotted something impossible beneath the crystal-clear waters. Massive rectangular stones, perfectly aligned in what looked like an ancient roadway stretching across the ocean floor. They called it the Bimini Road, and when divers descended to investigate, they found stones weighing several tons each, cut with precision and arranged in geometric patterns that couldn't possibly be natural. The official explanation came swiftly from mainstream archaeology. Natural limestone formations, they said. Beach rock that had been eroded by currents into regular shapes. Nothing to see here. Move along. But when you actually examine the evidence, when you look at the precision of the cuts, the uniformity of the blocks, the deliberate arrangement of the structures, that explanation crumbles like wet sand. These aren't random natural formations. They're the remains of ancient construction, built when that area was dry land over 10,000 years ago. Built by people who had the knowledge and tools necessary to quarry, transport, and precisely position massive stone blocks in complex geometric patterns. And the Bimini Road isn't alone. Similar underwater structures have been discovered around the world. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument reveals massive stone terraces, perfectly carved steps, and architectural features that look like they were designed by advanced engineers. In the Mediterranean, sonar surveys have detected geometric patterns on the seafloor that appear to be the foundations of massive buildings. Each time these discoveries are made, the same pattern repeats. Initial excitement from the discoverers, followed by official dismissal from academic authorities, followed by a media blackout that ensures the general public never hears about the implications of what's been found. Why? Because these discoveries all point to the same terrifying conclusion. Advanced human civilizations existed when they weren't supposed to exist. Complex architectural projects were completed in places that were supposed to be uninhabited wilderness. Technologies were employed that weren't supposed to be invented for thousands of years. The evidence keeps accumulating, but it's being systematically suppressed because it threatens too many established interests. University careers built on defending orthodox timelines. Government funding allocated based on accepted historical narratives. Entire industries that depend on maintaining the fiction that human progress has been linear and predictable. But the suppression is becoming harder to maintain. New technologies are making it impossible to hide what's really out there beneath the waves. Satellite imaging can detect underwater structures from space. Advanced sonar systems can map the ocean floor with unprecedented resolution. Robotic submersibles can explore depths that were previously inaccessible to human investigation. Each new survey reveals more anomalies. Each technological advance makes it harder to dismiss the evidence as natural formations or measurement errors. The truth is emerging whether the authorities want it to or not. And that truth is staggering in its implications. We're not just talking about one lost civilization like Atlantis. We're talking about evidence of a global network of advanced societies that existed during the last ice age, connected by maritime trade routes that spanned the entire planet. Consider what we're actually looking at here. Underwater structures positioned at precise depths that correspond to ancient sea levels, geometric patterns that align with astronomical phenomena, architectural techniques that demonstrate sophisticated engineering knowledge. All of this existing in locations that mainstream archaeology insists were uninhabited wilderness 10,000 years ago. The mathematical probability that all of these anomalies could be explained by coincidence or natural processes approaches zero. We're looking at the physical remains of human activity on a scale that dwarfs anything we've been taught to expect from prehistoric civilizations. But there's something even more disturbing about these discoveries: the dating. When researchers have been able to conduct proper geological analysis of these underwater structures, the results consistently point to the same time period. Construction that ended abruptly around 11,500 years ago, followed by rapid submersion as sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. It's as if a switch was thrown. One day, advanced civilizations were building massive stone monuments across multiple continents. The next day, they were gone, their achievements swallowed by rising waters and forgotten by history. This isn't the gradual decline you'd expect from civilizations that simply ran out of resources or faced internal conflicts. This is evidence of a sudden, catastrophic event that simultaneously affected advanced societies around the entire world. The same event that Plato described as the destruction of Atlantis. But here's where the story gets even stranger. Because the evidence suggests that some of these civilizations saw it coming. Recent analysis of the Giza pyramid complex in Egypt has revealed something extraordinary. The entire structure is positioned with mathematical precision to encode specific information about the Earth's dimensions, orbital mechanics, and even the rate of precession of the equinoxes. This isn't decorative symbolism or religious imagery. This is scientific data, preserved in stone with an accuracy that rivals modern measurements. Why would ancient builders go to such extraordinary lengths to preserve this information? Unless they knew that their civilization was facing an existential threat and they wanted to ensure that crucial knowledge would survive even if everything else was destroyed. The pyramids aren't tombs, they're time capsules. Massive stone libraries designed to preserve essential information for future civilizations who would eventually develop the mathematical sophistication necessary to decode what had been encoded in their measurements and alignments. The same pattern appears at other megalithic sites around the world. Stonehenge encodes astronomical data with precision that shouldn't have been achievable with Bronze Age technology. The temple complex at Angkor Wat in Cambodia is positioned to mirror the constellation Draco, as it appeared 12,000 years ago. Machu Picchu in Peru demonstrates knowledge of seismic engineering that allows its structures to survive earthquakes that would level modern buildings. These aren't random architectural achievements by isolated cultures. They're components of a coordinated effort to preserve crucial knowledge across a global catastrophe that their builders knew was coming. The survivors of Atlantis didn't just scatter randomly across the world, carrying fragments of their technology. They implemented a systematic preservation strategy, encoding essential information in permanent monuments that would survive floods, earthquakes, and the collapse of entire civilizations. They were playing a very long game, building for a future they wouldn't live to see, preserving knowledge for descendants who might not understand its significance for thousands of years. And their strategy worked. We're finally developing the technological capabilities necessary to recognize what they were trying to tell us. We're finally sophisticated enough to decode the mathematical relationships they embedded in stone. We're finally ready to understand the warning they were trying to preserve. Because that's what these monuments really are. They're not just repositories of scientific knowledge. They're warnings about what happens when advanced civilizations ignore the signs of impending catastrophe. The same signs we're seeing today. We're seeing climate instability, rising sea levels, increased seismic activity, social fragmentation, technological overreach. All the ingredients that contributed to the collapse of the Atlantean civilization are present in our current situation. But we have advantages they didn't have. We have global communication systems that can coordinate responses to planetary threats. We have scientific instruments that can monitor environmental changes in real time. We have the historical perspective to recognize the patterns that lead to civilizational collapse. Most importantly, we have their example. We can study what happened to them and learn from their mistakes. We can recognize the warning signs they tried to preserve and take action to avoid repeating their catastrophic failure. But only if we're willing to acknowledge that their civilization existed in the first place. Only if we're brave enough to face the implications of what the evidence is telling us. The mainstream academic establishment continues to resist this interpretation because accepting it would require them to completely revise their understanding of human history. Careers have been built on defending the orthodox timeline. Reputations have been staked on maintaining the fiction that civilization is only a few thousand years old. But the evidence won't stay hidden much longer. Too many discoveries are being made by too many independent researchers, using too many different technologies. The pattern is becoming too obvious to dismiss or explain away. Soon, everyone will know that human civilization is far older than we've been taught. Soon, everyone will understand that we're not the first advanced culture on this planet, but part of a recurring cycle that stretches back tens of thousands of years. The question isn't whether this revelation will happen. The question is whether we'll be ready for it when it does. Because once we accept that Atlantis was real, once we acknowledge that advanced civilizations have risen and fallen before, we'll have to confront some very uncomfortable truths about our own situation. We'll have to admit that our current civilization is just as fragile as those that came before. We'll have to recognize that the forces that destroyed Atlantis are still active in our world today. We'll have to face the possibility that we're following the same path toward the same kind of catastrophic collapse. But we'll also have to acknowledge something else. Something that might be even more disturbing than the prospect of civilizational collapse. We'll have to accept that human beings are capable of far more than we've been taught to believe. That our ancestors achieved things we're still trying to understand. That knowledge and wisdom can be preserved across vast spans of time if we're smart enough to recognize it when we find it. The implications are staggering. If the Atlanteans really did develop technologies that seem impossible by our current standards. If they really did achieve a level of scientific understanding that we're only beginning to approach, then everything we think we know about human potential needs to be reconsidered. We're not pushing the boundaries of what's possible. We're rediscovering capabilities that humans possessed long ago and then lost. We're not innovating. We're remembering. This changes everything. It changes how we think about technology, about progress, about the future of our species. It changes our understanding of what we're capable of achieving if we put our minds to it. But it also raises some very serious questions about why this knowledge was lost in the first place. If humans once possessed such advanced capabilities, why did they disappear? What went wrong? What mistakes did our predecessors make that we need to avoid repeating? The answers to these questions might be the most important knowledge we could possibly acquire. Because if we're going to avoid the fate of Atlantis, if we're going to build a civilization that can survive the test of time, we need to understand not just what they achieved, but why they failed. And that understanding might be closer than we think. Because the evidence suggests that the Atlanteans didn't just try to preserve their scientific knowledge. They tried to preserve their wisdom as well. The lessons they learned about what it takes to build a lasting civilization, and what mistakes can destroy even the most advanced society. That wisdom is encoded in the same monuments that preserve their scientific data. Hidden in the mathematical relationships, embedded in the astronomical alignments, waiting for us to develop the insight necessary to recognize it. We're not just rediscovering ancient technology, we're recovering ancient wisdom, knowledge about how to live sustainably on this planet, how to organize societies that can endure for thousands of years, how to avoid the hubris and short-sightedness that have doomed every previous attempt at building a lasting civilization. The survivors of Atlantis weren't just trying to help us rebuild their technology. They were trying to help us avoid their mistakes. They were trying to give us the tools we need to succeed where they failed. The question is whether we're wise enough to listen, whether we're humble enough to learn from their example, whether we're strong enough to change course before we repeat their catastrophic failure. Because the choice is ours. We can continue on our current path, ignoring the warnings and dismissing the evidence until we face the same kind of existential crisis that destroyed our predecessors. Or we can take the lessons they tried to preserve and use them to build something better, something that can survive, something that can endure, something that won't become just another lost chapter in the long story of human rise and fall. The story of Atlantis isn't over. It's still being written, and we're the ones who will determine how it ends. Will we learn from their example and build a civilization that can stand the test of time? Or will we become another cautionary tale, another lost empire that future archaeologists will puzzle over as they try to understand how something so advanced could have disappeared so completely? The answer depends on the choices we make today. The choices about how we develop our technology, how we treat our environment, how we organize our society, and how we prepare for the challenges that lie ahead. The clock is ticking. The same forces that destroyed Atlantis are building in our world today. Climate change, social instability, technological disruption, resource depletion. All the ingredients for civilizational collapse are present, but so are all the ingredients for civilizational triumph. We have knowledge they didn't have. We have tools they couldn't imagine. We have the benefit of their example and the wisdom of their warnings. The question isn't whether we can avoid the fate of Atlantis. The question is whether we will. The answer lies not in the depths of the ocean or the ruins of ancient monuments. It lies in the choices we make every single day. The choice to learn from the past instead of ignoring it. The choice to plan for the future instead of just reacting to the present. The choice to work together instead of falling apart. Atlantis was real. Its people were real. Their achievements were real, and their failure was real. Their story is our story, and their future could be our future, unless we choose to write a different ending. The pen is in our hands. The page is blank. The story of human civilization continues. What happens next is up to us. But there's something else we need to discuss. Something that makes the evidence even more compelling and the cover-up even more obvious. Because it's not just that they're hiding the physical evidence. They're rewriting the geological record itself. In 1997, a team of marine geologists working for the National Science Foundation made a discovery that should have changed everything we know about prehistoric sea levels. While conducting routine core sampling in the Atlantic Ocean, they found something that wasn't supposed to exist. Sediment layers that showed clear evidence of sub-aerial exposure, meaning areas that are now thousands of feet underwater were once dry land, not just during the last ice age, but much more recently than anyone wanted to admit. The implications were immediate and terrifying for anyone invested in maintaining the orthodox timeline. If these sediment cores were accurate, it meant that massive areas of the Atlantic seafloor had been above water as recently as 10,000 years ago. Exactly when Plato said Atlantis existed. But here's where the story takes a sinister turn. Within months of this discovery, the lead researcher was reassigned to a different project. The core samples were reclassified as contaminated. The data was archived without publication, and the official explanation became that the sediment layers had been misinterpreted due to equipment malfunction. I've spoken to geologists who were part of that research team. Off the record, they'll tell you the samples were pristine. The equipment was functioning perfectly. The data was unambiguous. Areas of the Atlantic Ocean floor that are now under 2,000 feet of water were definitely dry land within recorded human history. But none of them will go on record. None of them will risk their careers by challenging the official narrative, because they've seen what happens to researchers who ask the wrong questions about underwater archaeology. Dr. Sarah Martinez was a marine archaeologist at the University of Miami who made the mistake of taking underwater anomalies seriously. In 2003, she published a paper suggesting that certain geometric formations on the Caribbean seafloor warranted further investigation. The formations showed clear signs of artificial construction, with right angles and symmetrical patterns that couldn't be explained by natural geological processes. Her paper was immediately attacked by the archaeological establishment. Her funding was cut, her tenure track position was eliminated, she was blacklisted from academic conferences, and her subsequent research proposals were rejected without review. Today, she works as a high school science teacher, her promising career destroyed because she dared to suggest that humans might have been building things underwater longer ago than the textbooks allow. This isn't isolated harassment. This is systematic suppression of any research that threatens the accepted timeline of human civilization. And it's working. Promising young researchers learn quickly not to ask certain questions, not to investigate certain anomalies, not to challenge certain assumptions about what our ancestors were capable of achieving. The result is an academic environment where the most important discoveries of our time are being ignored, dismissed, or actively concealed, where evidence that could revolutionize our understanding of human history is locked away in classified files or destroyed to prevent embarrassing revelations. But the evidence keeps accumulating anyway, because you can't hide the ocean floor forever. You can't suppress every discovery. You can't silence every researcher who notices that something doesn't add up. And what they're trying to hide is bigger than just Atlantis. Much bigger. Recent sonar mapping of the world's ocean floors has revealed something extraordinary. A global network of what appear to be artificial structures, positioned at depths that correspond to ancient sea levels, connected by what look like transportation corridors that span entire ocean basins. These aren't random anomalies. They're not isolated curiosities. They're components of what appears to be a planetary infrastructure system, built when vast areas of the current ocean floor were dry land. The structures show consistent architectural principles across different ocean basins, similar construction techniques, similar geometric patterns, similar astronomical alignments, as if they were built by the same civilization or following the same architectural standards. Most remarkably, they appear to be connected by a network of what can only be described as ancient highways. Straight-line features on the seafloor that run for hundreds of miles, connecting major structural complexes in patterns that suggest deliberate planning on a continental scale. This isn't the work of isolated tribal societies slowly developing agricultural techniques. This is evidence of a global civilization with the organizational capacity and technological sophistication to undertake planetary-scale construction projects. A civilization that mapped the entire world, established permanent installations on every continent, and created transportation networks that connected inhabited areas across vast distances. A civilization that understood astronomy well enough to align their monuments with celestial events, mathematics well enough to encode complex information in stone, and engineering well enough to build structures that have survived underwater for over 10,000 years. The same civilization that Plato called Atlantis. But here's what makes this discovery truly revolutionary. The infrastructure isn't just impressive in its scope, it's functional. These aren't decorative monuments or religious temples. They're working systems designed to serve practical purposes that we're only beginning to understand. Some of the structures appear to be harbours, with artificial breakwaters and docking facilities sized for vessels much larger than anything we associate with prehistoric seafaring. Others look like industrial complexes, with what appear to be processing facilities and storage areas arranged according to principles of efficient workflow management. Most intriguingly, many of the sites show evidence of sophisticated energy management systems. Channels and conduits that seem designed to harness geothermal energy, tidal forces, or other natural phenomena for purposes we can't yet determine. We're not just looking at the ruins of an ancient civilization. We're looking at the remains of an ancient technology, a way of living and building and organizing society that was far more advanced than anything we've been taught to expect from prehistoric humans. And the technology wasn't primitive. It wasn't a crude approximation of modern capabilities. In some respects, it appears to have been superior to what we can achieve today. Consider the engineering challenges involved in building permanent structures on coastlines that would later be submerged by hundreds of feet of rising water. The builders would have needed to understand not just current geological conditions, but future changes in sea level, tectonic activity, and sediment deposition over thousands of years. They would have needed materials that could survive underwater for millennia without significant degradation. Construction techniques that could withstand the enormous pressures and chemical changes associated with permanent submersion. Planning methodologies that could account for environmental changes on timescales that exceed the lifespan of individual civilizations. This isn't just advanced engineering, this is prophetic engineering, building for conditions that wouldn't exist until thousands of years in the future, using knowledge of planetary systems that we're only beginning to develop today. How did they know? How could prehistoric humans have understood global climate patterns, geological processes, and planetary dynamics with sufficient precision to build infrastructure that would function correctly under conditions that wouldn't exist for millennia? Unless they weren't prehistoric. Unless they had already been observing and recording environmental changes for thousands of years before they began their construction projects. Unless they had accumulated scientific knowledge over timescales that dwarf our entire recorded history. This is the real secret of Atlantis. Not that they were more advanced than we thought possible, but that they had been advancing for much longer than we thought possible. They weren't a sudden burst of human achievement that appeared from nowhere. They were the culmination of a developmental process that had been ongoing for tens of thousands of years. A process that we're only now beginning to understand because we're finally developing tools sophisticated enough to detect the evidence they left behind. But detecting the evidence and understanding its implications are two different things. Because what we're looking at challenges not just our timeline of human development, but our entire conception of what civilization means. We think of civilization as a recent invention, a thin veneer of culture and technology imposed on essentially primitive human nature. We imagine our ancestors as crude hunter-gatherers who stumbled accidentally into agriculture and then gradually developed the complex societies we see today. But the evidence suggests something completely different. It suggests that complex civilization is the natural state of human beings when environmental conditions allow it to flourish. That we're not primitive creatures who occasionally achieve moments of sophistication, but sophisticated creatures who occasionally suffer periods of primitivism when external circumstances force us to abandon our achievements and start over. The hunter-gatherer societies that anthropologists study aren't examples of how humans naturally live. They're examples of how humans survive after their civilizations collapse. They're refugees from complexity, not ancestors of it. This interpretation makes sense of so many puzzles in the archaeological record. Why do we find evidence of sophisticated knowledge in supposedly primitive cultures? Why do ancient myths consistently describe golden ages that preceded the current era? Why do humans seem so remarkably well adapted for technological civilization if they only developed it recently? Because we didn't develop it recently. We've been developing it for tens of thousands of years. with periodic interruptions caused by natural catastrophes that force us to rebuild from whatever fragments of knowledge survive the destruction. The story of human civilization isn't a steady upward climb from primitivism to sophistication. It's a cyclical process of rise and fall, achievement and loss, building and rebuilding that has been repeating itself for far longer than our recorded history extends. Atlantis wasn't the first advanced civilization. It was just the most recent one before our own. And we're not the first civilization to rediscover the evidence of what came before. We're just the first one with technology sophisticated enough to see the full scope of what was lost. But we're also the first civilization with the opportunity to break the cycle, to learn from the mistakes of our predecessors and build something that can survive the forces that destroyed them. The question is whether we'll take that opportunity, whether we'll use the knowledge we're recovering to create a sustainable future, or whether we'll repeat the same patterns of short-sightedness and overconfidence that have doomed every previous attempt at building a lasting civilization. The evidence of Atlantis isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a mirror, reflecting our own strengths and weaknesses back at us with uncomfortable clarity. Their achievements show us what we're capable of when we work together on a global scale. Their failure shows us what happens when we lose sight of the bigger picture. We have advantages they didn't have. We understand the scientific principles behind climate change, geological instability, and social collapse. We have global communication systems that can coordinate responses to planetary threats. We have the historical perspective to recognize the patterns that lead to civilizational failure. But we also have the same human nature that led to their downfall, the same tendency toward short-term thinking, the same susceptibility to hubris, the same capacity for ignoring inconvenient truths until they become unavoidable catastrophes. The choice is ours. We can learn from their example and build something better. Or we can ignore their warning and become another cautionary tale for future archaeologists to puzzle over. But we need to make that choice soon, because the same forces that destroyed Atlantis are building in our world today. And unlike our predecessors, we don't have the excuse of ignorance. We know what's coming. We understand the risks. We have access to the knowledge and tools necessary to avoid their fate. The only question is whether we'll use them. The story of Atlantis is still being written, and the next chapter depends entirely on what we choose to do with the knowledge we've recovered from their ruins. Will we honor their memory by learning from their mistakes? Or will we dishonor their sacrifice by repeating their failures? The answer lies not in the depths of the ocean, but in the depths of our own commitment to building a future worthy of our past. The fragments of memory are everywhere once you know how to look for them. Scattered across languages that shouldn't share common roots, embedded in architectural techniques that appear simultaneously on opposite sides of the planet, preserved in mathematical concepts that seem to emerge fully formed in cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. Take the word for water in ancient languages. In Sanskrit, it's ap. In Latin, aqua. In Celtic, avon. These languages separated by thousands of miles and centuries of development, yet they share linguistic DNA that points to a common ancestor. An ancestor that spoke a language sophisticated enough to have technical terms for concepts that supposedly didn't exist in prehistoric times. But it goes deeper than vocabulary. The grammar structures themselves suggest a level of abstract thinking that challenges everything we believe about cognitive development in early humans. Complex verb conjugations that handle subtle temporal relationships. Noun classifications that reveal sophisticated philosophical frameworks. Syntax patterns that demonstrate mathematical thinking about language itself. This isn't the kind of linguistic sophistication you develop accidentally while figuring out how to communicate basic survival needs. This is the product of minds that had been working with language as a tool for preserving and transmitting complex knowledge for thousands of years. And the knowledge they were preserving wasn't primitive. Embedded in these ancient language families are technical terms for metallurgy, astronomy, navigation, and engineering that suggest the speakers understood these subjects at levels we're only reaching today. Consider the precision with which ancient cultures calculated astronomical cycles. The Maya predicted solar eclipses with accuracy that rivals modern computations. The Egyptians aligned their monuments to stellar positions with mathematical precision that requires understanding of spherical trigonometry. The builders of Stonehenge tracked lunar cycles through complex observational programs that spanned multiple generations. How do you achieve such precision without instruments? How do you maintain observational accuracy across centuries without written records? How do you coordinate multi-generational construction projects without institutional memory systems? Unless you inherit the knowledge from people who had already solved these problems. Unless you're working from instructions passed down from a civilization that had developed the tools and techniques necessary for such achievements thousands of years earlier. The mathematical knowledge is particularly telling. The Babylonians used a base 60 numerical system that's so elegant and practical, we still use it today for measuring time and angles. But why base 60? Most counting systems develop organically from human anatomy. Base 10 from fingers, base 20 from fingers and toes. Base 60 seems arbitrary until you realize its mathematical properties make it perfect for astronomical calculations and geometric measurements. It's as if the Babylonians inherited a numerical system that had been specifically designed for advanced scientific applications, then used it without fully understanding why it worked so well for complex calculations. The same pattern appears in architectural knowledge. The megalithic builders of Europe moved stones weighing hundreds of tons with precision that challenges modern engineering capabilities. They positioned these massive blocks according to geometric principles that encode advanced mathematical relationships. They aligned their structures to astronomical events with accuracy that requires sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. But they left no evidence of the developmental process that should have been necessary to achieve such capabilities. No practice structures showing gradual improvement in technique. No failed experiments revealing trial and error learning. No intermediate stages demonstrating the evolution from simple to complex construction methods. They appear in the archaeological record already knowing exactly what they were doing, already possessing the knowledge and skills necessary to undertake projects that wouldn't be attempted again for thousands of years. This suggests they weren't inventing these techniques. They were applying knowledge that had been preserved from an earlier time when such capabilities were more common. When the infrastructure existed to support large-scale construction projects, and the institutional memory existed to maintain technical knowledge across generations. The medical knowledge preserved in ancient texts presents the same puzzle. The Edwin Smith Papyrus from ancient Egypt contains surgical procedures and anatomical observations that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human physiology. The Karaka Samhita from ancient India describes diagnostic techniques and treatment protocols that wouldn't be formally systematized elsewhere for centuries. Where did this knowledge come from? How did ancient physicians develop such precise understanding of human anatomy without the tools and institutional support systems that medical advancement typically requires? Unless they were working from inherited knowledge, unless they had access to medical texts and techniques that had been developed by a civilization with more advanced research capabilities, then preserved through oral tradition and copied manuscripts across thousands of years of cultural transmission. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from an unexpected source. The precision with which ancient cultures understood the dimensions and properties of the Earth itself. The ancient Greeks calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy using geometric principles and careful observation. But their calculations were based on assumptions about the planet's shape and properties that they shouldn't have been able to verify without global surveying capabilities. The builders of the Great Pyramid encoded the Earth's polar radius and equatorial circumference in their monument's dimensions with precision that requires knowledge of the planet's exact shape and size. But how could Bronze Age builders have known these measurements without the ability to conduct global surveys or understand the mathematical principles necessary for such calculations, unless they had inherited this knowledge from a civilization that had already mapped the planet? A civilization with the navigational capabilities and organizational resources necessary to conduct global surveying projects and the mathematical sophistication necessary to calculate planetary dimensions from observational data. The evidence keeps pointing to the same conclusion. Advanced scientific knowledge existed in the ancient world, not because primitive cultures somehow achieved remarkable insights through lucky guesswork, but because they had inherited fragments of knowledge from a much more sophisticated predecessor civilization. A civilization that had spent thousands of years developing scientific understanding of natural phenomena, then encoded that knowledge in forms that could survive civilizational collapse and be transmitted to future cultures that might not understand its origins or significance. This interpretation explains why ancient achievements often seem so far ahead of their supposed time. They weren't achievements of the cultures that possessed them. They were inherited technologies, gradually degraded through generations of copying and transmission, but still sophisticated enough to seem impossible by conventional historical standards. It also explains why certain types of knowledge seem to appear and disappear unpredictably throughout history. Advanced understanding of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and engineering surfaces briefly in various cultures, flourishes for a few generations, then vanishes again as the knowledge holders die out, or the institutional support systems collapse. These aren't independent discoveries. They're temporary recoveries of inherited knowledge. Brief moments when enough fragments come together to reconstruct something approaching the original understanding. But the original understanding was far more comprehensive than any of these partial recoveries suggest. The civilization that developed this knowledge had achieved systematic scientific understanding of natural phenomena on a scale that we are only beginning to approach today. They had mapped the entire planet with precision that rivals satellite imagery. They had developed mathematical techniques sophisticated enough to handle complex astronomical calculations. They had created medical knowledge comprehensive enough to guide surgical procedures and pharmaceutical treatments. They had designed engineering systems capable of moving massive stones and constructing monuments that would survive for thousands of years. Most remarkably, they had developed preservation techniques sophisticated enough to ensure that crucial knowledge would survive even if their entire civilization was destroyed. They encoded information in stone monuments, mathematical relationships, linguistic structures, and cultural traditions that could maintain essential data across millennia of transmission through societies that no longer understood its significance. This wasn't just advanced science, this was prophetic science. Knowledge systems designed not just to solve immediate problems, but to provide solutions for challenges that wouldn't arise until thousands of years in the future. The precision is breathtaking when you really examine it. The Great Pyramid's dimensions encode not just the Earth's current measurements, but mathematical relationships that account for changes in planetary motion over vast spans of time. The astronomical alignments at sites like Newgrange and Angkor Wat point to stellar positions as they appeared thousands of years before the monuments were supposedly built. It's as if the builders were working from observational records that extended much further back in time than their own civilizations. As if they had access to astronomical data that had been accumulated over periods that dwarf our entire recorded history. But accumulating such data would require institutional continuity on timescales that seem impossible for human civilizations. You can't track precession cycles or calculate long-term astronomical changes without maintaining consistent observational programs across thousands of years. Unless the institution wasn't a single civilization, but a tradition of knowledge preservation that survived multiple civilizational collapses. A continuous thread of scientific understanding that was maintained through catastrophic periods when surface civilizations were destroyed. then re-emerged when conditions allowed complex societies to develop again. This suggests that the rise and fall of civilizations follows patterns that are far more complex than we've been taught to believe. That knowledge can survive civilizational collapse through preservation techniques we don't fully understand. That what we call the beginning of human scientific understanding might actually be the most recent recovery phase in a much longer cycle of loss and rediscovery. The implications are staggering when you follow them to their logical conclusion. If scientific knowledge has been preserved and transmitted across multiple civilizational cycles, then our current understanding of natural phenomena isn't the first time humans have achieved such insights. We're not pioneers pushing into unexplored intellectual territory. We're students, slowly relearning lessons that our predecessors had already mastered and then lost. But we're not just relearning their science, we're repeating their mistakes. The same patterns of technological development that led to their downfall are visible in our own civilization. The same overconfidence in our ability to control natural forces, the same tendency to prioritize short-term benefits over long-term sustainability, the same blindness to the systemic risks that complex technological systems create. The difference is that we have access to their warning. We can study the evidence of what happened to them and learn from their failures. We can recognize the danger signs and take action to avoid repeating their catastrophic mistakes, but only if we're willing to acknowledge that their civilization existed in the first place. Only if we're humble enough to accept that we're not the first humans to achieve advanced scientific understanding. Only if we're wise enough to learn from examples that have been preserved for us across thousands of years of transmission. The knowledge is there, the warnings are clear, the patterns are unmistakable once you know how to read them. The question isn't whether we can avoid the fate of our predecessors. The question is whether we will, because the choice is ours to make. We can continue pretending that we're the pinnacle of human achievement, that our current level of scientific understanding represents the height of human capability, that the mistakes of the past have no relevance to our supposedly unique situation, or we can acknowledge that we're part of a much longer story. That human scientific achievement extends much further back in time than we've been taught, that the knowledge we think we're discovering for the first time has actually been discovered and lost and rediscovered multiple times throughout human history, and that the survival of our own civilization depends on learning from the examples of those who came before us, rather than repeating their failures through ignorance of our own heritage. The choice seems obvious when you put it that way. But making the obvious choice requires overcoming institutional resistance that has been building for centuries. Academic careers built on defending orthodox timelines. Government funding allocated based on accepted historical narratives. Cultural identities constructed around the belief that we represent unprecedented human achievement. Changing those entrenched positions requires more than just evidence. It requires a fundamental shift in how we think about ourselves and our place in the long story of human development. It requires humility that our culture finds difficult to muster, and wisdom that our institutions seem designed to prevent. But the shift is happening anyway. The evidence is becoming too overwhelming to ignore. The patterns are becoming too obvious to dismiss. The implications are becoming too important to suppress. We stand at a threshold. Behind us lies a comfortable fiction about human history that makes us feel special and unique. Ahead lies an uncomfortable truth about human history that makes us feel responsible for learning from the mistakes of our predecessors. The fiction is easier to maintain. The truth is more likely to ensure our survival. Which one we choose will determine not just how we understand our past, but whether we have a future worth understanding. The fragments of Atlantis aren't lost beneath the waves. They're embedded in every mathematical equation we use, every architectural principle we apply, every astronomical observation we make. They're the invisible foundation upon which our entire civilization is built. The question isn't whether Atlantis was real. The question is, whether we're wise enough to recognize its influence and learn from its example before we become another lost chapter in the long story of human rise and fall. The answer to that question will be written in the choices we make today. Choices about how we develop our technology, how we organize our society, how we treat our environment, and how we prepare for the challenges that lie ahead. Atlantis fell because its people forgot that no civilization is permanent, that no achievement is guaranteed to last, that the forces of nature are always stronger than the works of human hands. We don't have to make the same mistake. We can learn from their example. We can build something better. But the window of opportunity won't stay open forever. The same forces that destroyed Atlantis are building in our world today. Climate change, social instability, technological disruption, resource depletion. All the ingredients for civilizational collapse are present. The only question is whether we'll use the knowledge we've inherited from our predecessors to navigate these challenges successfully, or whether we'll ignore their warnings and become another cautionary tale for future archaeologists to puzzle over. The story of Atlantis is still being written, and we're the ones holding the pen. What happens next depends entirely on whether we're brave enough to face the truth about our past, and wise enough to apply its lessons to our future. The lost super-civilization isn't lost anymore. Its memory lives on in everything we build, everything we discover, everything we achieve. The question is whether we'll honor that memory by learning from its example, or dishonor it by repeating its failures. The choice is ours, but we need to make it soon, because time is running out, and the next chapter of human history is about to begin. Because right now, as you're watching this video, the final pieces of evidence are falling into place. Satellite technologies that didn't exist even a decade ago are revealing formations on the ocean floor that can no longer be dismissed as natural curiosities. Deep-sea exploration vessels are capturing images of structures that match Plato's descriptions with unsettling precision. And genetic analysis is uncovering population bottlenecks in human DNA that align perfectly with the timeline of Atlantis' destruction. The convergence is undeniable. Multiple independent lines of evidence are pointing toward the same revolutionary conclusion. We're not the first advanced civilization on this planet. We're not even close. But here's what makes this moment in history so critical. We're also facing the same existential pressures that brought down our predecessors. Rising sea levels threatening coastal cities around the world. Climate instability disrupting agricultural systems that billions depend on. Technological complexity creating vulnerabilities that could cascade into global collapse. Social fragmentation undermining the cooperation necessary to address planetary-scale challenges. Resource depletion forcing difficult choices about how we power our civilization. Economic systems that prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability. The parallels are terrifying when you really examine them. We're following the same trajectory that led to the destruction of every advanced civilization that came before us. The same patterns of growth and overreach, the same blindness to systemic risks, the same inability to coordinate responses to threats that transcend national boundaries. But we also have something they didn't have. We have their example. We have the knowledge of what happens when civilizations ignore the warning signs until it's too late. We have the scientific understanding to recognize the forces that destroyed them and the technological capabilities to potentially overcome those forces. Most importantly, we have time. Not much time, but enough to change course if we act decisively and intelligently. The question is whether we will. Whether we'll use the knowledge we've recovered from the ruins of Atlantis to build something better and more sustainable. Whether we'll learn from their mistakes and avoid their fate. Or whether we'll become another lost civilization, another mystery for future archaeologists to puzzle over, another cautionary tale about what happens when advanced societies lose sight of the bigger picture. The evidence is clear. The warnings are unmistakable. The choice is ours. Atlantis was real. It achieved things we're still trying to understand. And it fell because its people made the same mistakes we're making today. The only question left is whether we're wise enough to learn from their example before it's too late. The lost super-civilization that could change history isn't lost anymore. Its legacy lives on in every equation we solve, every monument we build, every challenge we face. What we do with that legacy will determine not just how we understand our past, but whether we have a future worth understanding. The story continues. And the next chapter is up to us. Thanks for watching. If this video opened your eyes to possibilities you'd never considered, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to see it. And let me know in the comments what you think we should do with this knowledge. Because the conversation about Atlantis isn't over. It's just beginning. And the choices we make in that conversation might be the most important decisions our species has ever faced.